Hello everybody and welcome back to another episode of our Magnum OPUS Podcast. Today I'm going to have a little bit of fun with you guys. I've built a list of all the important words that we need to take a look at and need to know in music. So if you ever have a question or are wondering what a specific word means, this includes tempo markings like adagio or style markings like staccato and anything and everything in between. This is your go-to place to kind of help figure out what they are. This is some of the most common ones. I do have a list compiled here, and I'm going to rattle them off from top to bottom. I have them alphabetical, but this is by no means complete or full. There's loads more words I can't just fit into one 10-minute podcast here. But let's go ahead and get started. So we're going to begin with a cappella. 2 words, the letter A and then cappella. This means without musical accompaniment. This is both a genre of music and a way to sing. So if you sing a cappella, that means you are singing without a piano or any other kind of musical accompaniment. Accelerando. Fairly simple, we know it. It means with increasing speed, or you are slowly speeding up when the accelerando begins. Accent. This is a mark that is used for stress or special pronunciation. Very commonly, people refer to it as an articulation, but that's not always true. It is a accent, or it's a stress or special pronunciation on a specific note. Accidental. This, of course, is a musical notation that makes a note sharp, flat, or natural. We'll cover more on those later. Accompaniment. This is, of course, a musical part that supports other parts. Now, it does not necessarily mean that the piano player accompanies the singers. It can mean that if you have melody and accompaniment, melody is that main line that the musician wants to bring out, and accompaniment is that underscore so the melody does not seem flat. Adagio. This is a tempo marking that means slowly. It is one of the slower markings. It is slower than allegro and slower than andante. Next up, allegro. In a quick and lively tempo. You can think of this at slightly faster than walking speed. Alto. This is the lowest female singing voice. The 4 lines are alto, soprano, alto, tenor, and bass. Andante. Another tempo marking. This is at a moderately slow tempo. So it is faster than adagio, but slower than allegro. Articulation. This is fairly important. This is the manner in which we begin our notes. There is an attack, sustain, and release of each note. The articulation, of course, refers to the attack of a note. Next up is aria. An aria is an elaborate song for solo voice, most commonly found in operas, but not always. Atonal. 1 word, atonal. And this is a genre of music that is characterized by avoidance of traditional diatonic scales. What that essentially means is that there's no home base that can be easily discerned just by listening to the piece. We can't say this is a aria in D major if the piece is atonal, for example. Next, ballad. A ballad, similar to an aria, is a narrative poem of usually popular origin. And this is a little bit slower. It can also, in jazz, be referred to as a slower and more melodic piece. Next up, we have bar, as in musical bar. It's a notation for a repeating pattern of musical beats. This ends the measure. Baritone, the second lowest adult male singing voice. Also baritone, which is the second lowest brass wind instrument, right above the tuba. Baroque. Baroque is a style of music that is characterized, if you know your music history, from about the years 1600 to 1750. It is characterized by elaborately ornamented music. Bass is, of course, the lowest part of our musical range. We have bass singers. They are the lowest singers. Next, we have beat, which is essentially a basic rhythmic unit in a piece of music. This is our tempo. It's our steady beat that we keep consistent throughout all of our music. Next up is cadence. Cadence is a close of a musical section. And we talk more about cadences in our Advanced Music Theory podcast section. However, it's essentially the close, the end of a phrase. When you put a period at the end of your sentence, that is a cadence. Cadenza. This is a solo passage, essentially occurring near the end of a piece of music. Not all pieces have cadenzas, and not all cadenzas only occur in solo music. Next, we have canon, spelled C-A-N-O-N. And this is a piece of music in which melody is imitated in other parts. It is very similar to a round, but it is not quite the same. Pachelbel's canon is one of the most famous examples of a canon. Cantabile. This is Italian for smooth and flowing. It means in a singing manner, so keep things very smooth, very connected with very light articulation. Cantata, C-A-N-T-A-T-A. This is a musical composition for voices and orchestra. So maybe you've seen it before if you either sing or play an orchestra instrument. Maybe you haven't. Chorale. A chorale is a very stately hymn that's put to music. It oftentimes has very rigid chord changes, and everybody often, but not always, all parts move together. Next, chromatic. Chromatic essentially means that you are moving by a series of half steps. So a chromatic scale, for example, you start on any note that you wish and you proceed 12 half steps up till you get to a higher octave. Coda. A coda is a closing section of our musical composition. Most oftentimes you see it after there is a repeat, such as DC al coda. Crescendo. This is an easy one. You start at one volume and you gradually increase in volume until the end of the crescendo. And then of course there is decrescendo, and this is a gradual decrease in loudness. Next there is development. And many pieces have a development, but not all of them. This is more common in longer works, such as concertos. A development is a section of a composition where major themes are kind of elaborated on. You can think of it that way. We have key changes, we have modulations, we have themes that come back in many different variations, and maybe different themes all together. Next we have diatonic. This is a word you maybe have heard before, but I'm not quite sure what it means. If a piece is diatonic, that essentially means that it is based off a Western scale. So we have our series of whole steps, whole, whole, half, whole, 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 half, that kind of builds the music forward. Next there is dissonance, which is essentially just a disagreeable sound, two disagreeable sounds that are played together. The two most common dissonant intervals are a half step or a tritone, which is also known as the devil's interval. Next, I want to talk about embellishment. An embellishment, essentially, it literally means to make more beautiful. An embellishment can either be a grace note, a turn, a mordant, a trill, anything that adds beauty, you could say, to the note. Vibrato is a type of embellishment. Next, etude. An etude is a short, very technical composition, usually for a solo instrument, so it would not be accompanied. Etudes are wonderful pieces of music that everyone should learn. Usually, they have a theme about them, such as scale work, shifting, key changes, or lip slurs if you're a brass player. Next, we have exposition. Very important word, which means this is essentially a section of a movement where your major musical themes first occur. You first hear your melodies. Exposition is similar to, but also quite different than the finale. The finale is the closing section of a musical composition, oftentimes where those themes from the exposition are brought back for one last time. Next up, tell me about fugues. Fugues are a musical form that consist of a repeating theme. Again, not to be confused with a canon or a round. Fugues start off with a melody, and then the melody comes back over and over again, but it is one instrument playing. Gavotte! What the heck is a gavotte? All those Suzuki players out there that have played 10,000 gavottes. It is an old, formal French dance, which means you would often see people dress up to dance in a gavotte, oftentimes at dinner parties. I have another tempo for you, and it is grave, or grave. I've heard it pronounced both ways. This is a dignified and very somber tempo with sometimes elongated notes, lots of tenutos. Essentially means in a very grave manner or character. Next is harmony. Now the literal definition for harmony is compatibility. So if something is harmonious, that means that these sound waves are compatible with each other, and thus they sound quite good. Hymn. A hymn is a song of praise, spelled Hymn. Very, very common in the piano world. Very important word to know, interval. The interval is the difference in pitch between two notes. It's essentially a measure of musical distance. Next we have key, like key signature. Best definition I can give you guys is it's a diatonic scale that provides essentially a tonal framework for your musical piece. So it gives you the start and end note to your diatonic scale and that series of whole and half steps. One more tempo marking I want to leave you guys with is largo. Largo means slowly and broadly. So not as slow as grave, but this is a very, very lethargic almost sort of piece with lots of big broad tones and expression. Alright, we're doing good. Next up is leitmotif. Get a little bit of a German vocabulary for you. Leitmotif spelled Leitmotif. All one word. This was essentially, it's a melodic phrase that accompanies a person or event or situation. Think about Harry Potter's theme that pops up every time you see Harry Potter. He's got his own leitmotif. Next is maestoso. Maestoso is a fun one because it essentially means majestic. This is a style of music to play in. Again, we want to think big and broad, lots of maybe harder accents on the top. Very, very impressive. If it's as though a king was walking down the aisle and you accompanied them. Next, this is my favorite word, magnum opus. A magnum opus refers to a composer's finest composition of their life. Two very important M words after that are moderato, which essentially means moderate. This is a very, very common tempo marking you see, and it's right in the middle. A very comfortable, almost walking speed sort of feel to it. Nothing fast, nothing slow. Follow that up with modulation, which I've mentioned earlier. A modulation is a musical passage that changes from one key to another. So you are changing key signatures and you're changing tonics. We talked about leitmotifs, but a motif is slightly different. Spelled M-O-T-I-F, this is a theme that is repeated and even elaborated upon in a piece of music. A leitmotif, remember, is assigned to a specific character or place or thing. A motif is just a specific theme that is repeated or elaborated on. Next we have octave, and this can be explained in a couple different ways. Probably the easiest thing to think about is it's a musical interval of 8 notes. This is when you start on a note and you travel up or down so far that your alphabet, those notes you use, start to repeat themselves. A to A, B to B, C to C. I also want to mention opera. Opera is essentially a drama that is set to music. Musical theater that has, well, music to it. It's our prerequisite to the movie. Next I have polyphonic. And to break it down, we have poly, P-O-L-Y, and then phonic. This means that there are more than one musical instrument or musical line being played at the same time. For example, a duet is a form of polyphony. A word everyone should know is presto. Presto is a very, very fast tempo, faster than allegro. Also important is the word recapitulate, which essentially means to repeat an earlier theme of a composition. Composers recapitulate their earlier themes oftentimes in the finale of a piece. Rubato means to have a flexible tempo that is not strictly on the beat. Lots of give and take. Soprano is of course the highest musical voice that we have. And then there's staccato, which is essentially separating the notes. Not to be confused with short and crunchy, staccato means separate. And of course we can't forget about syncopation. Syncopation is musical rhythm that accents a normally weak beat. So if you have an eighth note rest and then a quarter note, that is a syncopated rhythm because your strong beat, so to speak, is normally beat 1, but you rest there, so you have to play on an off beat. Let's start to round things out here with texture. Texture is the musical pattern that's created by multiple parts being played together. You can layer parts to have a thick texture, or you can strip them away to have a very thin texture. Almost done, we have timbre, spelled T-I-M-B-R-E. Timbre is the distinct property of a sound. It's why a piano sounds like a piano, and it's why a guitar sounds like a guitar. And lastly, for your consideration, is the word vivace, which translates directly to lively. This is another speedier tempo, and it oftentimes means slightly shorter notes that are played together at a fast tempo. Okay, everybody, thank you so much for joining me on our first speed run of musical vocabulary that everybody should know. Hope you have a wonderful rest of your week, and I will see you next time.